This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Forging Table. The mission of Undaunted.Life is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. At the Forging Table, you'll see a group of regular guys forging spiritual resilience by digging into God's Word, and we're welcoming all of you to come along on that journey. That's Caleb, that's Robert, that's the Horn, Ryan Horn, and we are digging into the very, very last chapter of Nehemiah 13. And again, guys, one of my favorite books in the entire Bible. I just love the lessons here. And as we've talked about in previous weeks, there are leadership lessons here. There's lessons about how to be a good father, how to be a good citizen, how to be a good steward of the talents that you've been given. I mean, there's so many good things. There's political lessons here, all kinds of stuff. But this is the end. And what you would normally be expecting with such an epic story up to this point is just some sort of grandiose ending to this entire thing about Nehemiah, because this is the last time chronologically we hear about Nehemiah in the scriptures in terms of what was actually historically happening. But we definitely don't get that. We do not get that big dramatic ending. This isn't that awesome theatrical ending that we were hoping for. But there is still a whole lot of great stuff that we can look at in terms of Nehemiah 13. But Ryan, even right from the beginning, you were talking about off air, even in the first a couple of verses rather, there's some pretty important stuff, and it attaches to other parts of the Old Testament as well.
Yeah, so it actually goes back to Numbers, and they call it the Book of Moses, and in it was found written, "No Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God," so enter the temple, "for they did not meet with the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them." So during this time, Balaam was a prophet, and the Moabites basically brought him in to curse the Israelites. And as he got up to curse them, he could only speak praises. God changed his tune and made him speak praises of the Israelites rather than curses. And so Balak, I think is the king's name in Numbers, was very upset with this. And so basically Balaam told the king, the only way to defeat the Israelites is to send your women. Send your women in there. And they basically sent their women in there. The men fornicated, the Israelite men fornicated with those women. Those women bore children, their children. And guess who was taking care of those children? The Moabite women. I mean, it's basically what Prima Nocta and the from Braveheart, it's like, hey, if we can't kill them all, let's breed them out. And that's basically what they pulled here. But this kind of sets up to what's going on now. We were building up this crescendo at the end. Like, is everything going to work out great? And it's like, it's not, because Jesus hasn't returned yet. I mean, this isn't where it ends, but it ends not very well for the Israelites here. I mean, Nehemiah comes back, and he comes back to them falling back into their old ways. And so Elisha the priest basically is a member of the family.
Did you say Elisha? Did
I say Elisha? Extra B. Sorry,
Joby is going to light you on fire.
I can't read from far away.
Elisha will bring it closer to Elisha.
Eliashib.
I like Elisha.
I like Elisha too.
I'm sorry, I couldn't let it go.
It's all good.
Come on.
Elisha, who was appointed to the chambers of the house of God. So this guy is appointed to the chambers of the house of God, was a relative of Tobiah. We all remember Tobiah and that jerk.
Yeah.
So who's a Moabite, and they prepare a room for him in one of their largest chambers. The chambers that are supposed to hold the taxes, the first fruits, the things to keep the Levites going. What brought them into their I went brain dead, into the 70 years of captivity, was how they didn't take care of the house of God and how they broke their covenant. They're doing it again. And this time, the guy that tried to kill Nehemiah, they built a house for him in the house of God.
And he was related to Tobiah, and his name's Eliashib. Is that how it is?
I mean, I ruined it all. So at least I got Tobiah right.
Hey, you nailed Tobiah. Joby. You absolutely nailed Tobiah. But Robert, since you have the silkiest voice out of all of us, the strong, the jockoist type voice.
I'm actually talking to the
if
mic.
you talk into the mic, it'll work great for you. But if you will into the mic, read verses 4 through 7, and then we'll discuss.
Oh no, I've got to mess up Elishib.
No, just Elisha.
Okay,
just get it close.
Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah, And he had prepared for him a large room where previously they had stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tithes of grain, the new wine and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests.
So go ahead and read verse 6 and 7 as well.
But during all this, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. What do I got here?
Artaxerxes.
Artaxerxes. Fantastic. King of Babylon. I'd returned to the king. Then after certain days, I obtained leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Elisha had done for Tobiah in preparing for him a room in the courts of the house of our God.
So there's so much here right from the beginning, because this is totally when the cat's away, the mice will play situation. So in here we have what you set up, Ryan. We have a relative of Tobiah, a guy that was literally trying to lure Nehemiah away to kill him, is now like integrally involved in what's happening and the goings on inside the city. And then we see that Nehemiah had fulfilled his promise to King Artaxerxes, that he didn't violate the trust of the king, because the king trusted that he meant it, that, hey, I'm your cupbearer. I'm basically keeping you and the rest of the royal family alive right now, but I need an undefined period of time to be away from you to do something that's only important to me, that's only like somewhat important to you. And so he goes back, and immediately, like again, there's like months and months and years like in here, even in these few verses, but immediately the people start falling away, and they start putting, bad, corrupt people in places of power. And they were led by these people. And what they essentially did, and this is how we talked about it off air, they went back to their old ways, like just right from the jump. Like the boss wasn't there. And so they went back to screwing around, playing horse with, a waste paper basket and, balled up piece of paper. Like it's just the cat's away, the mice will play. And it's like, man, we're not different from people 2,500 years ago. We're still like this.
I could just imagine Nehemiah's anger. It's like back when I had a house and I had roommates, like let's just say like my worst enemy of my roommates, like not with my roommates, but somebody that we know mutually. Like I'm gone for a business trip and I come back home and that guy's sitting in my living room, watching a movie, drinking my good whiskey. Like I would lose my mind. Like I totally get his anger. It's just like, seriously guys, like one, you're my bros and you're deciding that you're going to let this guy into our house. On top of that, he's drinking my good stuff. Like, I mean, the best wine was in that storeroom. I guarantee you Tobiah was drinking that wine. Yeah. Everything that was left for the Levites and the priests, Tobiah was putting his fingers in.
Well, this was like 12 to 15 years later. My understanding is 12 to 15 years later that he comes back, right? The 32nd year of Artaxerxes. So one thing that I thought of here was that, when they're looking for a place for Tobiah to stay, it's like, oh, we're not doing anything with that room, right? So go stay here. Well, that's because they began being disobedient a long time ago, right? Because that was the room that was previously for offerings, right? It was for them to, if they're keeping the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath year, where they don't labor, and they're taking care of all those offerings to put in there, then they wouldn't look around and say that room's available, So it was other, like the way I think of this is like, it's other disobediences that lead to more disobediences, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's that they're reaping what they're sowing. So, I'm thinking of the application standpoint. It's like there are little things that you can either stop doing or start doing that are going to lead to far worse things.
Yeah.
It's just funny how they break a covenant like they were all repentant of, and they signed the seal and they did everything. And then they come back. It's so easy within 10 to 12 years.
Yeah. But again, like Caleb was saying, it's a slow fade. What was it? They were giving 10% of the first fruits. And did that go to 8% one year? And then slowly it went down to 5 and then to 3. And then they just quit giving. And then that room went empty. And then it sat empty for a couple of years. And it's kind of like it's how we are in sin.
They didn't
how many areas of our life do we look at? And if we were to fast forward, or if we were to go back 10 years ago, sometimes we would catch ourselves in a position that we would never be where we are today. 10 years ago, we would have thinking that we would have put all of the safeguards in place that would have protected us and guarded us and kept us in these railings where God wants us to be.
The sad part, it wasn't even a lot. It was a third. They only had to do a third of a shekel. So it was probably a third of grain, a third of wine. So they didn't have to come out like a half, like what was usually taxed. They were given the least and still couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Within 10 to 12 years.
Couldn't.
They decided they wouldn't.
Oh, that somehow doesn't apply to me because Nehemiah is not here anymore. Caleb, what version do you read from?
NASB.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be like the Message or something like that. So if you wouldn't mind reading verses 7 through 9.
Goes that far.
Yeah. And I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil of Eliashib had committed for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courtyards of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household articles out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms, and I returned the utensils of the house of God there with the grain offering and the frankincense.
So as I was reading through this, I'll admit, I didn't catch this until after, which the word cleansed should have been like a trigger for me, because as you guys know, my favorite description of Jesus in the Gospels is whenever he showed us just a hint of the Lion of Judah when he cleansed the temple. There's some people believe that happened once. I agree with the scholarship that says that actually happened twice. So we see that in Matthew 21:12, starting in Matthew, or it's in Matthew 21 and in John 2. And so I see it as him clearing the temple right at the beginning of his ministry, and then clearing the temple after he had arrived back in Jerusalem the week of, Passion Week, right? Whenever he would end up dying on the cross. But regardless if you believe that it happened once or twice, this is where we got to see righteous indignation acted out in real time by the Savior. He didn't lose his cool. He didn't regret it later, which is how most of us would categorize our anger. So when we get mad and, punch a wall or throw something or say a bad word or make a comment towards somebody or get in a fight, of course, we since we're not sociopaths, we're going to come back later and be like, oh, man, that was pretty freaking stupid. But this is a direct corollary, and that's what a lot of the commentaries I read to what was done at this time to what Jesus did in clearing the temple. And Jesus's accusation was that, you've turned this father's house into a den of robbers, of thieves, and you've made business of my father's house. And what was happening in the temple at that time, this just occurred to me, is business was slowly encroaching into the everyday nature of what was happening in the temple. That's not how it was originally started. They didn't build the temple and then say, all right, let's set up our shops, right? But it was just that slow creep towards that, and that's how it ended up happening. How do you think it happened here as well? Nehemiah leaves to go back and be with King Artaxerxes and kind of serve out his duties as cupbearer before he comes back for a second governorship. And while he was gone, slow creep. There's a lot of connections here.
It's greed. Greed caught up with them. I mean, that's why they opened the gates in the Sabbath and opened the Holy Temple for basically business, and it came back and haunted them, and it's going to come back and haunt them again when Jesus comes back. So, or when Jesus comes.
And it takes I don't know. I think you can relate this over to business in some ways, and you can go if you don't have, a chief of operations that is making sure that everyone adheres to the systems and processes of the businesses. How easily can things fall away? And they can go into a state of disrepair to where there's eating into your profits. You can do it in a household where you don't have a father that's active and morally holding everybody accountable to spending time, as a family, in prayer or eating meals together or keeping the house in check or respecting mom or what it is, and how quickly things just lead to a state of disrepair. I mean, there has to be someone of significance that's in charge, that's willing to hold the line to be able to keep everything on the path that God intended it to be, to operate well.
Yeah, and it's just, I think he ends up doing that by appointing a treasurer. He basically comes in and fires everybody. It's like Nehemiah figures out, like, maybe I have to live here for these people just to get it right. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was crazy to read about the Levites and how they were not given their portions, and then they had to flee to their fields. So like the Levites weren't being honored the way they were supposed to be honored in the covenant. And so they had to go and work. They had to eat, they wanted to live in a dry place and eat, and they couldn't do that there because they weren't upholding their covenant. And who knows what was in the storehouse? Maybe the storehouses were empty because they sold it for money rather than giving up that first fruits to the storehouse. So it's just, I just don't, I guess it's hard to kind of like, and we all do it, and we all probably subconsciously do it, but like, we know what's right and wrong. Why do we always revert back to this certain area? You know, it's like,
let's talk about the phrase you used, Robert, which is hold the line. Okay. So as we see in this chapter, we see small detours away from God's law, but they can end up being catastrophic. So the good thing here is that Nehemiah had come back there to rebuke them, but tithing was neglected, right? It became less important to these people. Sabbath was ignored, right? But it wasn't ignored outright immediately. It was a slow creep towards the Sabbath being ignored. The marriages were being mixed again, which again is not a defense of not intermixing races or anything like that. It's a completely different time, completely different context. But at the time, they were not supposed to be mixing with other people groups outside of Israel or outside of Jerusalem. And there was no wood for the temple offerings.
Can you be so bold as to go into that of saying we've got to train up our kids to be able to marry other Christians? I mean, that's kind of a bold topic for us to talk about right now. But I mean, obviously, we're not looking at it from a racism standpoint.
Right.
We're not looking at it from an ethnicity of any kind. But I think we are looking at it from an alignment with God. We are God's people. And how are we guarding our children to be able to stay in alignment with that covenant?
Right. How many fathers are all too eager to ignore the fact that the dude that is now asking for their daughter's hand in marriage has no connection to the Christian worldview, no connection to Christ or the discipleship therein. But, you know, he's a good-looking guy. He can protect her. He's got a good job. He can provide for her. And so they ignore the parts that could send their daughter and their grandkids to hell potentially, right? You know, living in a bad house doesn't send you to hell. Don't misunderstand me. But it's like, let's say your daughter's not even a Christian at that point. Like, I think you're spot on. Like, fathers with daughters out there, but even fathers with sons, it's like when you're talking about not being, you know, unequally yoked, that's what they're talking about. And that doesn't mean, oh, well, because this is where I grew up not going to church, and my wife grew up going to Church of Christ, and I thought that meant unequally yoked. It's like, oh, I started going to a Baptist church. She goes to Church of Christ, and they're kind of weirdos. And so I need to, you know, do something different. But it's like they don't have any attachment, no discipleship. They're not following Christ at all. And you're just like, yeah, but he makes six figures.
We know the ruin that can come from marrying a non-believer, right? Either way, you know, man, woman, doesn't matter. But the ruin that can come from that is far worse than the ruin that you could have of, let's say, struggling through life because you can't hold a job, you know, or you don't have the best accommodations, or you don't have family around, or whatever it is, right? Is that ruin is so temporary and so much less than the eternal ruin that you could have by not knowing the Lord. And certainly for any kids that come out of that marriage. So, I mean, absolutely that's a call to us that rings true without a doubt, is that, you know, you can kind of look back at like the time when there were arranged marriages. Mm-hmm. It's like, I kind of like that idea.
Yeah. There's something there,
you know?
Right?
It's like,
it's not as crazy as it sounds on its head.
Yeah, exactly. And 100%, like, this is not talking about, where you're from, like what you look like, what your skin color is, none of that. It's that if our God is your God, then we're on the same page. Yeah. Then we're equally yoked.
But they're also just trying to keep their society going. You know, they're trying to stay as a people, and you can't do that. And it comes back to what was happening in Numbers. They're trying to breed them out. And so you look back in Nehemiah when we talked about this in 10, is they, you know, who's going to be able to read the Hebrew if we decide to marry the Moabites, and the Moabite women are teaching our children the Moabite ways and not teaching them our language? They're going to slowly die off as a people if they become unequally yoked.
Yeah.
And it goes back to a sickness that when you brought this up, Robert, so you're a dad, you're trying to be pragmatic. Your girl's so excited about her beau. And she, you know, she's ready. She's already thinking about what it's going to be like to walk down the aisle, and the pictures and the bridesmaids' dresses and the whatevers and this and that. But fast forward 5 years, your beautiful young Christian daughter now has a kid or two in tow to church by herself.
Yep.
Because the guy doesn't see any value in doing that. That's what your family does. That's y'all's tradition. I'm going to go hit some golf balls. I'm going to go to the shooting range. I'm going to go roll. I'm going to go do something else. And so now you have a bride that is doing missionary dating while married. And so by missionary dating, I'm not talking about a position of sexual intercourse. I'm talking about people that will date the problem, like the girls that date the problem boy, like, I can fix him. Like, he just needs me, and I can fix him. I can bring him to Jesus. It's like, no. The odds of you doing that and fixing him versus the odds of him dragging you down into his degradation, oh my gosh, there's a major inequity there. Yeah. But again, just like the people in Nehemiah's day, they were all too willing to just, I won't hold the line here.
So check this out, a little story. I'll try to go fast with it, but it's definitely in my playbook. A buddy of mine from Southeast Kansas, all-state wrestler, whenever he was growing up, man, he really, really liked this girl. And it was a real small community, Caney, Kansas. And he finally got up the courage and asked this girl if he go on a date. And so he shows up at her house. She is the church girl. He is the opposite of that in every possible way. And he gets over to the house and walks in, and she says, well, my dad's in there in the kitchen. And so he walks in, kind of introduces himself to his dad. Dad backs his chair up, turns over to him, and he says, come here, boy, come sit down. He's like, all-state wrestler. He's like, I really like this girl, but what am I doing here?
For those of you who know, he wasn't tapping the chair next to him. He was tapping his own leg. For those of you not watching this, his own leg.
Yep, Dad just sit there, tapped his leg like this, asking this big old, wrestler to come over and come sit down. So he walked over, and he's like, I really like this girl. And so he kind of sat down, and the dad put his arm up on his shoulder, and he said, okay, all right. It's like, you want to date my daughter, huh? He's like, yes, sir. He said, all right. Well, you're going to date me too. And he said, what is it? You guys are going to go to a movie, maybe go to dinner. What was that, about 3 or 4 hours? He said, I'll tell you what, you come back next week and you work for 4 hours on the land with me, and then you can take my daughter for 4 hours.
Heck yeah.
And he did that the whole way through.
Did he have to bring him some foreskins after?
Yeah, no kidding.
No, slightly different.
But the point is, this kid that wasn't raised in church, wasn't a Christian, he discipled that kid, led him to the Lord. They ended up getting married, have 4 kids, love the Lord. So he invested the time into that boy that would come and be the potential suitor for his daughter.
That's awesome.
So, I think about that. I mean, that is in my playbook. I don't know if it's going to be the sit down on my lap boy, but I'm putting it in my playbook to invest that amount of time. I mean, I would rather give every asset that I have, if I were to liquidate it in a briefcase of cash, I would rather give that kid that cash than give him my daughter to be able to take out. And I think we lose the weight of what it is and the sacrifice that we need to go through in order to be able to guard our children and make sure that they do, marry somebody of that same Christian caliber.
Well, and guess who was watching as this was all going on when he's sitting on this guy's lap? The gal. She's watching this all go on. So let's say if the guy was like, I'm not sitting on your lap, get out of here. You just watched a young suitor of yours disrespect your father, right? Even though your father asked for something kind of ridiculous, he showed disrespect. And in the first time meeting your father, he gives that person disrespect. Like, does he do that to waiters and waitresses as well? Yeah. Is he going to treat the staff at a hotel poorly?
Yeah, it's going to treat her that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
that's right.
But then, like, what if he does? Let's say, let's walk this out. He walks over, he sits down on Dad's lap. Dad's got the arm around his shoulder. Dad pitches him on the idea of 3 to 4 hours. You're going to work for me. And he goes, I don't need to work for you. I'm taking your daughter out. Get out of here, old man. He doesn't. Again, if you're the girl, you need to feel valued. Mm-hmm. You're the apple of your father's eye. This guy's trying to get a bite at the apple and try to take over the apple at some point. And he's not even willing to do 3 to 4 hours of work, because think about it. We've all been, our first love situation or any of those teeny bop, love movies. I would do anything for them, but I won't do that. It turns into a Meatloaf song. It's just like you get to that point to where it's just like, hey, I would do anything for you. Okay. You willing to work the land with her dad for 3 to 4 hours once?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, think about the the stories from the Old Testament where you had to work.
7
You're in
years.
indentured servitude for 7 years.
And you don't even get the daughter.
And it's like,
the one you wanted.
JK, you're getting the ugly one. And so it's like, those are the situations. Like, I think that's a big deal. As fathers, you should look for that type of just commitment from a kid, because like, Caleb and I, we only have sons. And so we're a little bit different right now in terms of what we're going to be focusing on. But if I heard that, sweet baby James went over to a guy's house to take the girl out and instead went and worked the farm for a couple hours, I'd be like, let's go. Let's combine the families. This is how we're going to get after it. Like that's amazing.
Hit the table.
I did hit the table, but it wasn't like because
gusto.
I just like, I meant to do it, right? So it was with fervor, right? And it's what was meant to happen.
So as a dad with only sons, in light of, Balaam from verse 2, right? Saying that this is how you get them away is through your women. So I need some ideas for like, what's the inverse of that, right?
Yeah.
Because my wife, like, she'll do that. Whatever it is, like, she's in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, your wife's kind of a thug. I like it.
I think there is the time with family, right? I mean, I have 3 daughters. And so my wife and 3 daughters, any girl that's going to come and potentially like woo over brother, man, it's got to go through all those daughters. Now I know you have 4 boys, there's no girls that's there, but I think that there is an investment of time and seeing how they interact, that the other siblings really get a chance to get to know them, and before they go out on their own, there is a process of them together with the family. Maybe it is helping your wife out with a meal or, a project that's going on or something that she's doing. But
yeah, well, I wonder if that is the corollary to where it's like, maybe you as dad, you take a back seat, but then you see how they interact with mama.
Right.
Because like in our cases, we happen to marry lionesses that can take care of themselves,
right,
and they have appropriate levels of scary aggressiveness that I've seen in both your wife and mine. But like that's such a cool thing because you're getting to see how they interact with other people. And the point is not because they're dating your family or they're marrying your family. Because people say that you don't marry the girl, you marry their family. It's like, no, with the biblical worldview, it's like you don't become one flesh with their entire family, thank goodness. Like you're becoming one flesh just with them, and the family's just a byproduct. But that's what I tell people all the time that have, familial issues. It's like, well, you're not connected to them in the same way in the spiritual realm. Like it sucks that your father-in-law is a rude piece of crap, but at the end of the day, it's about you and your relationship with your bride. But I wonder if that's a good corollary.
And also just remember someday you don't have daughters now, but you will have 4.
Right.
Yep. There's the day where each one of those, and you want to get to know that girl and be able to give counsel to your son of, man, I get it, buddy. I say, she's beautiful, man. She's incredible. But son, do you really feel like she treats you right? Do you really feel like she honors you the way that you have seen me honor your mom? Do you see the way that she treats this, whatever that is, whether it's the good that you're highlighting or it's the negative that you're highlighting? I think just being there and being involved, I think, is the main process.
You got anything on that for what it's like from the other side for dads with sons?
For dads with sons, I mean, I just hope my son finds a godly woman, both of them. I hope they find somebody a lot like their mom. Their mom did a lot of, God did a lot. God did the changing in my life, but Rachel sure did help, in growing me as a man. Like I said a couple episodes back, like I was real DB, I was immature, I was stupid and selfish. And I think getting married and finally having to put somebody else before yourself, grows you. But then, adding kids to the mix is just an amazing thing because like you're all in now. It's not about you anymore. And so I want my sons to kind of realize that, when they have wives that they have, they have a sidekick, they have somebody that's next to them that's going to go through life with them, but they need to treat her with a lot of respect and love and dignity. I think the biggest thing that I want to instill in my sons is just lead your family to church. I mean, I feel like that's just something that lacks nowadays. Is like you said earlier in the conversation about, the mother leading the kids to church while dad's going to play golf. And that's so far too often what we see in our church nowadays. I mean, I see it in our church right now. You see all these women at church, but where are their husbands? If their husbands are there, are they watching the baseball game in the sanctuary when the pastor's preaching, because they don't want to miss an inning? It's like, our kids see that. Our kids know that. They know what we take seriously and what we don't take seriously. And I think it's just a call for men that church is something important. It's not just some legalistic thing. It's something that leads your family into a community and be a part of that community, not just be a byproduct of it. And I just see it far too often right now.
Yeah.
And you see so many connections to, okay, what is your family paying attention to and what things are they picking up? Because yes, kids pick up on those cues. But isn't it interesting? Because even in the last chapter of Nehemiah here, we see in verse 18, man, old habits die hard. And that doesn't mean just with individuals. It means with entire generations of people. Because verse 18 is, did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And so you might be thinking, oh, what's the big deal with the Sabbath? Well, it's a violation of God's law. That's not an insignificant thing, especially at this time. But I mean, what the reference being made here is back to the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah in 17:2. He rebuked these same people's fathers for doing essentially this exact same thing in the exact same way. And now they're doing it. And the way I see it is, some people will say, if your father was abusive, it's likely that he was abused and that he was abused and then that person was abused and you're probably an abuser as well, right? It's not exactly generational sin when people make that comment, but you've heard or seen some statistics about people that are sexual assaulters. Like they were likely sexually assaulted and the people that assaulted them were likely sexually assaulted and how it goes on. But there is a way that if you believe in generational sin and curses and all that, that's not what we're talking about today. But it's like things can stop with you. So let's say, because I have alcoholism in my family, there have been members of my family that have literally drank themselves to death when they were found by police. Vodka's coming out of the pores of their skin. Rough situation, right? There's also people that I know that have situations where there's been generational sexual sin. So whether it was abuse or looking at porn or prostitution or something like that. And so if you look at that as your identity, like, oh, I'm such and such so-and-so of a family of drinkers or a family of adulterers or a family of divorce or a family of whatever, like you're selling yourself short that you can't be the one that stops that. And so like in my family, whenever I drink responsibly. I've never been drunk. I've never been out of control drunk. My kids will see me consume alcohol, but they're never going to see dad just stumbling around, tripping over beer bottles, getting in fights. They're not going to see that. And I certainly didn't see that growing up. Like my dad drank responsibly my entire life that I've been around him. But I guess we sell ourselves short a little bit. But look at this 2,500-year-old rebuke. It's like, look, you idiots. Like, don't you know the scriptures just like I do? You've read Jeremiah. Why are you still doing this? And so I don't know where y'all want to take the conversation from here, but does that speak to the human condition? Is that sin nature? Is that the, long lasting impact of satanic and dark forces on all of us? I mean, it can go a lot of different ways.
It's sin nature. I mean, we all are, even as believers, are going to have a sin nature. I mean, that's why we need Christ. And so it's just, in those times, do we listen to the Holy Spirit? Do I listen to the Holy Spirit when it's one of those mornings on Sunday? I just rather not just go. I just don't want to because I'm tired. And the Holy Spirit's like, you need to go to church. You need to take your family to church. You need to lead. But you know what? I'm going to let my flesh take over and be like, no, I'm too tired. I'm going to block out the Holy Spirit. And that's what it comes down to. I mean, there's so many things that could come in front of us that our flesh could desire, like money, sex, you name it, that will keep us from listening to the Holy Spirit. And I think that's just basically what happened here is, I mean, they weren't listening to the prophets. They weren't putting God in front like they should. And they're breaking their covenant. And so I think that's where we run into in our modern day is we break our covenant with God as believers when we stop doing what he wants us to do. What he's called us to do. And he's laid it out in his book on what we should do. And we still don't follow it. We try to find pragmatic approaches around what he calls us to do. Why? Comfortability. Like you talked about, we just want to be comfortable.
Absolutely. So one other thing, you asked where we want to take it. One other thing I noticed was, obviously Nehemiah has grown leaps and bounds since chapter 1 to what's happened, but he still has the same, what I think is cool, the same steadfast conviction that he had at the beginning, right? When he was asking Artaxerxes for permission to go do this. And that's why he comes back on fire. You know what I mean? When he's clearing the temple, or the markets. So, one other thing that stood out was how he's talking about, this becomes a real like plea, personally for him. I mean, it's very personal, you can tell, but he's talking about our God. And then at the end of each kind of little section, he was talking about the Sabbath or marriage. He's talking about my God, and he really is thinking about like, and it ends with remember me. And I feel like it's kind of this personal, like, I did my best. I really was obedient to you. And I think it's one of those, like, we think about, the way that he is, you could just see it kind of deteriorating into this, like, he's a little bit, not hopeless, but he feels a little bit helpless, I think. And he's going from our God to my God and all. So
it goes back to Acts, like when I brought up about Paul, when he said, I declare today I've been faithful. If anyone suffers eternal death, it's not my fault. I mean, That's basically what he's coming back and saying at the very last sentence of this verse. Remember me, or this chapter, remember me, O God, for good. Like, remember that I try to get these guys to listen. I try to get them to understand. But you know what? It's not really on him. It's, God's going to open their eyes. And he opened their eyes in chapter 9. Joby, I missed that last episode, but it was chapter 9.
There you go.
So, in repentance of, how they were breaking the covenant. And it's always a thing. We're always going to be reminded of how we're breaking our covenant. And it's just human nature. It's human nature. And like that's why I talk about the building of this wall is also spiritual. It's a spiritual internal wall that's going to break and crack sometimes. But it's like, where do we put it? Do we put it back into our culture? Do we put it back into, my God, at this time they're putting it back into other gods. Are we going to do our modern God, who is us? Am I going to put it in the team of me? No, I'm going to put it in God's hands and try to patch up those cracks.
And yet we always find that balance between, did I do enough? Yes, it's on them. It's on them to be able to make the change. It's on them to be able to hear what I've said and to be able to correct. But then, and I am always left with this sense, this place within myself of, God, did I do enough? And then I think that's where that, oh my God, remember me. Did I do enough in this season for these people at this time to be able to get them where they should be? Did I do enough as a father to raise my children, to launch them in the world to follow after Christ? Did I do enough for my wife to know that she was truly loved, her whole life, by me and by me alone? And, it's that fine balance between being content, I think maybe, but then also, and I'm never satisfied. I'm always wanting to drive and do more and push harder and wherever that is. So.
Well, in the way I read the last part of the entire book of Nehemiah, remember me, oh my God, for good, is in the Christian mind, we should be humble. I think we understand that, whether we do a good job of that or not. I certainly don't do a good job of that often. But we should not be seeking recognition either. And I went to a fairly competitive school for academics, for sports. I had to compete for scholarships and different things like that. And when you do that, when you're steeped in that level of competition, you're constantly beating your own chest, because the reality of someone not trumpeting your horn for you is real. And if it's like, it's of no value to be the smartest kid to not get a scholarship. When you're looking at it specifically as dollars and cents. And so, then whenever I got to college, it's like, well, you don't just want to be at college, you want to be big man on campus. You want to dominate, you want to do these different things. And so it's antithetical to the Christian worldview. You want to get to a point where you don't seek recognition. But here at the very end of Nehemiah, as he's signing off, he is seeking recognition from the best source possible, from God. Because the whole way, when he could have enriched himself, he could have surrounded himself with grandiosity and how great he is and all these different things. But he was always prayerful, as you mentioned before on a previous episode, Robert. Like, he was prayerful. He would always pause. I think it was chapter 5 or something like that, to where it's like they didn't take governor's rations or something like that. They still spread stuff out, and like, those are really, really important things. It reminds you when you hear about people in the military where, their general will eat last, or whoever's running that team or the battalion or squadron or whatever, that they're going to make sure all their men are cared for before they're cared for. They're not going to stay in the officer's barracks they're going to stay out in the crap, with the grunts. And like, I think that that's a very important thing because, man, I'll just be real honest. If you're playing for an audience of one and that audience is supposed to be God, I lose sight of that a lot because, I'm in this competitive field of podcasting and speaking and all this stuff. And, when someone's speaking on stage, there can't be a second person on stage because they booked that person and not you. And, there's 3 million podcasts out there. Well, what if you fall out of a bunch of people's rotations? Well, that affects your bottom line. And I'm just trying to remember that even whenever this podcast had tens of listeners, I was working as unto the Lord. I put the same level of preparation into my interviews and my podcast as I do now with a much, much, much larger audience. And I think it's because I was trying to remember the source of where I should get my value and recognition, and that's from God.
You think that Nehemiah, when he came back and saw that they've like slipped back into what they were before, like he could have just like got it back on his donkey and just walked right back to Artaxerxes.
Yeah, all right, deal with it, morons.
Like he didn't give up on these people. How many times have we like try to build something up and we're building a business and then we have like these workers and they're not doing the right thing rather than be like just walking away, like we're not going to walk away. Like he built something, God worked through him and he could have just went and walked away and like, forget them, leave them in their sin. But no, he came back with throwing out people's stuff, pulling out people's hair, like he came back with a vengeance. And it just says, verse 30, thus I cleansed them from everything foreign. So he went after the guys that married outside of their, not their race, but their believing, believers, idolaters. So, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites. So fix that. And in his work, I provided the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. So remember me, O Lord, for good. So he went back and he fixed it and hoping that he fixes it, that they're going to stay on track, which we find out they don't 600 years later, but he could have walked away from it all. And like, I think that's a good to ask God, remember me. I just didn't give up. I kept fighting the good fight, going back to Paul.
Well, it was holding the line, as Robert, you were saying. Go ahead, Caleb.
I think it's a great point too. Like, I think the way I read that, so I purified them from everything foreign, is that basically everything that's not of you, Lord, is gone. Yeah. So I think when we're like evaluating our own life, the way we spend our time, money, those things, like that's what, just look at it like, is this of God? Right. Mm-hmm. So, also the way that he ends here, in my opinion, with the, just that plea is, for him, it's like a cry of desperation. And then I know we see it again, those words, the remember me, is I think of the thief on the cross, right? And that's different in that it's a cry of hope from him. So, I mean, it's remember me, Lord.
This last little bit, I have the New King James Version with this Dake Study Bible, but for this Bible I do. But it says, thus I cleanse them of everything. Both of yours says foreign. Mine says pagan. And it just kind of resonates in a different way, that I cleanse them from everything pagan. And
I think that's right. Because like when you look at foreign, you want to think of like different ethnicities. They're pulling them away from pagan gods.
But if it's foreign to the Lord, like what is foreign to God is pagan.
What is the opposite, which is foreign. So I think it's pretty cool to look at too. If we go all the way back to chapter 1 and just seeing him start out in lamentation and he ends in lamentation.
Lamenting. It's kind of the same thing we talked about last week, where it's like, okay, first thing he does is he surveys the damage at night, walks around the city. And the last thing he did is he surveyed what they had built. And like he was, again, people miss this when they read Nehemiah 1, is he was risking his life. Nehemiah 1 and 2, he was risking his life by looking sad in front of the king. Because Artaxerxes saw himself as a God king, not just a king, but a God king. And if you're in the presence of God, can you be sad? Like, can you actually be sad if you're in the presence of God? Could you possibly be thinking about any of the other problems in the world, the plight of your family? No, you're in the presence of God. But he was so distraught at just learning about the state of a city he had never been to. Like that the walls were broken down and that the people were broken down. And I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah. Ryan, you'd said something, I can't remember if it's on or off mic, but it's along the lines of being upset that the children couldn't even speak the language anymore, and how when they spoke the language, and if you cut back to 24, and of course 25 being one of my favorite parts of this verse, but is in 24, and half of their children spoke another language. They couldn't even speak the language of Judah. And if they can't speak the language, they can't interpret God's law.
Yep.
And so by their inability, and he came back, and off of that, the next verse in 25 is, so I contended with them, I cussed at them, I hit them, I pulled out their hair, and I made them swear by God. I mean, they're just, I think that anger of knowing that half of the kids couldn't even read the law, is I think where his real frustration, and therefore ended up coming up with his, him being somber afterwards, but he was so much anger.
Of course. I mean, how are you going to keep the covenant going if nobody knows what the covenant is?
Yeah.
How are you going to be a people if you don't know what, God's covenant is? And I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's just sheer stupidity.
Well, it's so interesting to me as well, because if you know much about Islam, you know that Muslims think that any translation of the Quran into any languages outside of Arabic are not actually the words of God. Again, this is what the Muslims believe, but like when it's translated into English or German or Dutch or whatever, like that's not the Quran anymore. It can only be read in Arabic. And you think about it in terms of us, and I'm not saying that Christians should do this, but when you hear people that know Greek and Hebrew and they can read it in the original language, I've heard people say before, reading the Bible in its original language is like watching, a movie in color, whereas reading it in English is like watching it in black and white. I think that, there are some certain problems with that, depending upon how far you take that out, because it's like, oh my gosh, do we actually have the words of God in front of us? Like, oh, this is scary. But I think that it's important that at this time, like Muslim culture today, over 1,000 years since Muhammad walked the earth and jotted these words down, like that they still look at that. They take that seriously. If you're a serious Muslim, like that's the direction that you're going. Like you will learn Arabic so that you can read the words of God in the way it was meant to be delivered to you. So that's not an insignificant thing. But as we see with Nehemiah, as we wrap up here, again, as I mentioned last week and I mentioned this week, you would think that this was going to end on a high note, that there was going to be some sort of hopeful ending. And, because, we've been steeped in Disney movies growing up, but that's basically not what happened here. If it had ended after chapter 12, it would have been okay. But what the thing is it points out the fact that they did what they could do at the time. They deviated from the plan that God gave for them, but God has to take over at some point and get done what he needs to get done. And it wasn't until hundreds of years after this that he did what the prophets pointed to, which is that there was going to be a sacrificial lamb, a Messiah that was going to be delivered to these people. And so that's the thing that, when people look for Jesus in the Old Testament and then they don't see him, like, where's Jesus in the story of Noah's Ark? Like, where's Jesus in, Jonah and the whale? Like, I don't get it. Like Job and his boils. Like, what's the point here? But it's like, just the fact that Nehemiah ends without and they lived happily ever after is pointing to the fact that God's work is not done on this planet. And it may be hundreds of years from now, it may be hundreds of milliseconds from now, but God is going to continue to work out his plan for humanity.
And it's pointing out that, they knew the law, they can't keep the law, right? Just like we can't keep the law.
Mm.
And that's, in my opinion, that's the most clear way that this points to Jesus, is that no, God's grace is coming, the new covenant is coming, and his name is Jesus.
I think it just comes down to faith. If you look at anything, we have faith now. We have faith in Christ and his resurrection and his death. When you look at people in the Old Testament, it just came down to their faith. And I think, they weren't going to be able to fulfill the law, because it's impossible. But the ones that are blessed are the ones that had faith in God and faith in what he could do and tried to follow the law. Yes, Jesus wasn't here, but we're going to see Moses in heaven. We're going to see David in heaven. Those guys are going to be there, the ones that kept the faith.
Well, guys, as we wrap up Nehemiah, are there any last thoughts on the book of Nehemiah? Again, I've said it and I'll say it again. It's one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, perhaps my favorite book of the entire Old Testament. There's just so much here, but anything we sign off before we put a bow on Nehemiah? We got head shake.
I'm good.
Yep.
Oh, you always have something else to add,
I
Ryan.
do.
And but we just covered it so well.
I really enjoyed the study of Nehemiah. It was really a good book to read. And it opened me up a lot spiritually. So I think it's great.
Well, very good.
I think everybody should read it.
Everyone should read it. You guys, you should have been reading it this entire time. Come on now. But we're going to leave that there. That puts a bow on Nehemiah. But come back next Sunday where we're going to start a new study in 2 Timothy. So we did 1 Timothy from the jump of the forging table, but next week we're going to be digging into 2 Timothy 1. So make sure to read that so you guys are prepared. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. Guys, if you like the forging table, the only way we're able to pull this off is because we have financial donors just like you. We have guys doing one-time gifts and donating on a monthly basis to the content that we're doing here. That is how we keep the lights on. That is how we are able to continue to produce content like this, is because we have financial donors. So the only link we've got for you today is a link to our donation page on our website, or you can just go to Undaunted.Life/donate. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. Also, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.